quick background about me. As we're pulling up slides, thank you. Don't forget to vote, number one, today. Number two, quick background about me, EE back in Germany. I hear a lot of echo. Is that just me? Okay. Then came to Case Western, did the PhD there, Fulbright Fellowship. And because there was a lot of surgery involved for about 3 years, the School of Medicine also gave me then a doctoral award. But it was a lot of fun. Went to a startup called Oculeaf, worked on dry eye. So we had a great experience there, was hired as the scientist and sold it to Allergan short while later, helped to integrate it. And then you're looking for something new. And this is what formed Neuronoff, because is there a way that we can actually create an interface? We just heard from Peter that it's all about the interface. I strongly support that, because while all the big companies are building better and better stimulators, those are the engines, we're providing the tires that actually stay on the road. So that's the way that I want you to look at that. The question that I was wondering to start with, and I'm starting my clock right now, just realized, so now I have 12 minutes. Why is pharma being treated differently, especially in the pain space, from devices? And as it's written there, this is not a mouse. So let's look at it from a patient-physician perspective. The patient visits the physician. We collect symptoms, we analyze and assess those. Then we review drug options. We discuss what kind of side effects there might be. We discuss what kind of contraindications you might have, and then say, all right, we lock in on a specific indication, specific pathway. Let's try it out. So that's the process in the clinical practice. And then we close the loop a short while later, where the physician basically asks the patient, how did it work? Are you feeling better? Did you notice the clinician usually doesn't ask, are your numbers X, Y, and Z better? That's what the clinician acquires. The clinician asks, are you feeling better? Meaning the clinician knows we care about symptoms, signs not so much. Signs are a way to measure it. So the question then is, for the physician, do we have a responder or a non-responder? There is a little bit of parallels to that in SCS space. There's none of that officially right now in the PNS space, even though SPR is being used in the PNS space as a trial lead before you put in a Medtronic off-label as a permanent or a StimWave or a NALU. And again, if it doesn't work, you shift your therapy following this kind of a process. So the question is, how do we replicate this kind of an experience with devices? Or let's start with the user experience. Meaning, patient visits physician, we collect the data, yada, yada, yada. Now we discuss device options. And there, the clinician will assess first, same kind of algorithm. Is there something that I can do non-invasively? Physiotherapy, chiropractor, other things in the pain space specifically. Is there a true minimally invasive option? Steroids, steroid injection. Is there what others call a minimally invasive option? For the device space, that could be a StimWave. I'm calling it minimally in quotations because when you pull it out, there's a scar that's left. Thank you. And then we have the option of either going to chronic, more invasive pathway, implanted IPG, ablation, fusion, laminectomy. Laminectomy obviously being what I would consider the maximum invasive approach. So once that algorithm has been performed, they will try this out for SCS. There's a trial lead. So in that process, what does the patient want? The patient wants a reduction of symptoms, and they want that reduction of symptoms right now. By the way, am I looking at the version with video, or is that the PDF that you pulled up by any chance? We'll see in a second. Okay, just double checking. Because those are, yes.
Yeah, because you're in Safari.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Sorry about that. So because I had updated that, I think I updated the wrong page. So then the clinician will assess with the patient what options there are. And what the patient really wants is, if there's a device being placed into me, is there a way that there is no scar that's visible, meaning it's a true minimally invasive or a non-invasive pathway? The clinician will, the patient will further ask, is there a way for me to have minimal follow-up pain? Because, for example, if you place a Boston Scientific or Medtronic paddle lead and you do a laminectomy for that, that's a very, very large pain that you will cause for about 4 to 6 weeks thereafter, just due to the laminectomy and exposing a lot of bone and thereby nerve endings. So what the patient wants basically is, if possible, No scalpel, no stitches, no scars. Also, preferentially, no cables dangling outside my back, because it would be really nice if I can more than shower, if I can change and not have to worry about pulling that cable out. And definitely there's the problem with twisting, bending, lifting. I don't know if this is clear to everybody. When you place a lead and you bend down, you change the length of tissue with respect to the lead. What does the lead do? It doesn't stretch. So if the lead starts to move, your electrodes move, meaning your therapy is not going to work anymore. So basically, that's why patients not very happy about that. So what the patient actually wants, we realized, and our understanding is a try lead to try things out. Summary, what does the patient want? They want a way to try things out so that they have a way to experience neuromodulation, but without the surgery attached to it. That's basically where we landed with that. So let's go to the next one. That would be, what's the physician experience? What would the physician want? They want to try things out as well, because at the end of the day, the physician has to prove to CMS or private insurance that the patient is a true responder. It's about 50-50 usually, depending on indication that you're talking about. Sometimes it's 30-70 distribution. That not every person that you put a trial lead into with current technologies will actually be responding 5-6 days out, and then they don't convert over to permanent. So if you could verify that, especially if you could do that for longer, then it would be a really good thing for insurance companies. Also, the clinician knows that I don't have to go back in and explant this thing when it's a permanent right away. Again, clinician wants a simple procedure, wants something that is fast to place, fast to remove, also to remove without anything being left behind. And they don't want, just as the patient, no worries about twisting, bending, lifting. I don't want to read out all these elements on here, but basically the big takeaway on this is, again, the clinician wants to have a very simple lead electrode that they can utilize to try things out. Last but not least, insurance company, the payer. Their number one point is, because they are usually not a charity, but do not see themselves as a charity, they want to save money. Their question is going to be, with your therapy that you're trying to attempt, am I going to save money in that patient population, statistically, probabilistically? And they want data. They love to see raw data as much as possible, because they have their own algorithms to analyze. And the more chronic data you can provide, the better. So if there is a way that you could actually do 30 days instead of 6 days, meaning you get into that subchronic space, then that's a good thing. And there's an interesting mechanism in the approval process in Europe, in Canada, and the US, that anything up to 30 days is essentially considered subchronic. So you're on a lower burden from an approval perspective. But you already are at that point that you have the electrode stabilizing itself, and you have a chronic kind of effect. So obviously, they don't want reoperations. They don't want to see migration, neither in the acute nor in the chronic phase. And last but not least, if there would be an option to use, quote unquote, just the lead, no need for an implanted pulse from generator in a certain patient population, that could be cheaper. That could be the same kind of benefit without the need to pay $30,000 instead, on top of the $6,000 for a trial. That's what the insurance company sees. All right, so pulling all of that together, Jim, this is not moving. Let's talk about possibilities and markets. I'm going to make this very short, just to basically summarize. If you look at all this is from publications. If you look at all the patients that receive neck and back steroid injections, you talk about approximately 1 million patients in the US per year. Of those, 1/4 do not respond to steroids. Of those, 1/3 become the entire market. That's that black circle down here. Once this thing disappears, that is the entire market for Abbott, Medtronic, Boston, and Nevro. Those 83,000. Out of those 250, if you subtract the 83, you're 170. 170,000 patients do not receive a benefit. That's a huge market opportunity, given that about 20 to 25,000 go to Abbott, Medtronic, Boston, and Nevro. The PNS space is obviously developing as well. And the other aspect is, if you treat relatively late, which is driven by insurance decisions, insurance has the power to push this back. And they do that because they know that on average, every 2 to 3 years, you will switch your insurance company due to your employer or your personal choice. And if they can push you to the next insurance company, then they are not out $30,000, the next guy is. So they will try to wait. But at the waiting time, costs them per year $8,000. So if you can be cheaper than those $8,000 in 1 or 2 years, you have a mechanism to convince the insurance company why you should come in earlier. So we took the following approach. We said, we need a 30-day trial lead. We need to have a way that we can leave that trial lead in for longer than 30 days. That's the next approval path, basically a 510K thereafter with clinical data. And if we have a tail connector on the trial lead that we can connect to an IPG, we can use our device and connect later on Medtronic, Abbott, etc., because we are no experts at building IPGs. We are experts at injectable electrodes. So as was just said, focus on your key competence and outsource to Medtronic, contract manufacturer Medtronic, the IPG. 2 minutes left. All right, I'll focus on injectrode. So here's an example of us placing this in hydrogel. I'm going to use 27 seconds as I'm talking about this. This is an example of us injecting, quote unquote, around the corner. Think about it as we can push on a rope, and that's a helical rope. And when we push it out of a lead, and we don't pull that, out of a needle, and we don't pull the needle back, we create an anchor. So we can define where exactly we have electrode and where we have anchors placed inside the body. Takes about 2 minutes to deploy that on the DRG, just as a quick shout out beforehand. And if you want to remove it, that's the way it looks after, for example, 4 weeks here on a posterior tibial nerve in an animal, where we pull on this and it, what we call unzips. Each one of these loops lets go one after the other. And usually this does not move until the very end, meaning you basically stretch this entire injectrode out. So what does it mean? You can put this device in about 2 minutes. We've had over 20 people, 20 clinicians place that at this point. We are almost 24 in on the DRGs using what's called a transforaminal approach. That's basically how you place a steroid injection. We can put it around the posterior tibial nerve halfway. We can even put it like a quote unquote horseshoe cuff. We inject underneath, then we pull the needle back, then we go above, inject the rest, pull the needle back. Now we have a quote unquote cuff injected with a needle. Last but not least, you can put it on the occipital and a couple of other nerves that you otherwise have really tough time reaching. I'm going to save us some time by just scrolling through this really fast. If you put this into rats and you want to test it for chronic reliability, you need to have a starting point and an end point. So we basically are going in right where the rib cage is. Then from the rib cage, blind, we push the needle to the back, go through the gluteus maximus, through the quadriceps, down to the innervation for the gastrocnemius muscle. And then we tell the animal while it's waking up, please do not twist, bend, lift 50 pounds or more. Just like 3-year-olds, if any one of you has kids, they do not listen. They use their leg relatively quickly to scratch themselves behind their ears. In other words, it could move. This is 1 year in. We have stim data that proves there's no problem with stimulation. I'm going to end on this one here that we can remove through a needle or with a needle, that we basically get our access down to the injectrode, have a grabber that's part of the removal device, grab it, pull it out. That's on a fluoro. This is both human cadaver study. And where we were taking this is this one first, replacing maximum invasive with minimum invasive. So you've got pedal leads on the right. It's not that BlackBerry was not able to access the internet or send text messages. It's that the iPhone was just simpler, better, and easier to do the same job. That's where we're taking this. Any questions that you may have, you can reach me at those contact information. And yes, we are in the process of raising around for any angels that might still be here. We are completely angel funded because this way we retain control of where we're taking this. Thank you.
So if all the panel members could come up, and I'm just looking at the time. So we have 25 minutes, both in terms of a little bit of backgrounds, but also discussion and Q&A. So Dr. Naidu, perhaps you can start, and I'm going to ask one question that you can integrate in your answer. What's that? Tell us a little bit about, you've been highly involved in neuromodulation, not only spinal cord stimulation, but also DRG mainstay, we're working early with companies like NALU and, been on the the cutting edge of a lot of these novel technologies. So talk about how you get involved with some of these new technologies. What do you look for? Certainly what Manfred has is, really revolutionary and exciting and solves a problem. And to that point, in terms of some of the problems that you have with the current technologies, where do you see the whole kind of sector, because all these are devices for pain, where do you see the innovation headed? I know that's a lot there, but talk it all, a little bit about your background, and then where is this all headed?
All right, perfect. So hi, everybody. My name is Ramo Naidu. I'm an anesthesiologist, pain physician. I work in Marin County, which is across the Golden Gate Bridge. I did my fellowship at UCSF here in San Francisco and stayed on for 5 years as assistant professor, and was asked by an orthopedic practice if I would join them to do neuromodulation. While I was at UCSF, I was working with the neurosurgeons, working with a lot of different physician groups, and really started becoming the neuromodulator for our pain management center, along with Dr. Porter, I think many of you know. This orthopedic practice understood that pain medicine would keep patients within their halo. So whether you're a knee surgeon, we all know that 10 to 20% of patients after knee surgery continue to have chronic pain after that surgery. The spine surgeons clearly saw the value in having someone like me. So I joined this practice called California Orthopedics and Spine 5 years ago, and I've been with them ever since. It's been a fortunate time for me in the last 10 years because you guys have all seen all this innovation and all of these startups coming through, looking at different neural targets. For me personally, as an anesthesiologist, I was always interested in regional anesthesia. I used ultrasound throughout my training. And so the application of placing leads to the periphery was very easy for me. And so Dr. Poré, who really didn't train with ultrasound when he was going through med school and residency, looked at me to do those things. So he helped me get involved with some of the companies early on, including Nalu, SPR, Bioventus, or was Bioness, et cetera. I jumped on this train because I saw where it was going. I think if you looked at neuromodulation in 2011, you were sort of like, great, the 50-50 club. You heard about a lot of complications, issues, et cetera. But I wasn't looking at the present, I was looking at the future. And that's why it's really cool to be here today, because you guys are all part of that. And where we're going with things, I think we've already talked about it to a great degree in the last two days, is miniaturization, really developing condition-specific evidence. And I'll probably get into that more in the next half hour about how we need that for all of the technologies. So I think I impact most of your questions right there.
Great, and we'll get into more in just a little bit.
Perfect.
So we also have Devjani Saha. She's a PhD director in neurology, regulatory affairs at MICRA, but you've also worked at the FDA, and you certainly worked with numbers of these companies going through. Tell us first a little bit about MICRA and some of the services that they have to offer, as well as your experience on the pain side, and how you can help some of the startups here. Do you want me to put your slides?
Yeah, maybe. Well, I can go up there.
Come up. Yeah, either way. Okay, we're good to go.
Can you guys all hear me? Okay, cool. Thank you guys so much. I know it is the last session of the last day, so we really appreciate it. And thank you to the organizers. It's been a really great meeting. So I just want to give a short blurb about what we do at MICRA and kind of my background. So I've been with MICRA for a little over a year. So prior to that, I was at the FDA for a little over 6 years, and most of the stuff that I've worked on is really reviewing neuro and phys med devices. And my expertise is really in the BCI world, as well as neuromodulation and neurorehab. So, I think it fits in really well with some of the devices that you guys have been discussing. I also helped launch the STEP program, or the Safer Technologies program at the FDA. And I was also a real world evidence lead. So, what really attracted me to MICRA, it was, for when you're at the FDA, it's really about the patient, and that's the safety and effectiveness is really what you're honing in on. What has really been exciting was talking to some of companies like yourself and being part of the team that is so close to this whole product life cycle, right? And at MICRA, we do that. It kind of houses everything. We do regulatory as well as generation of clinical evidence and market access and reimbursement. So it's really exciting because we all operate under the same NDAs. So if I have a regulatory question that I feel might impact reimbursement, I can just call my colleague really quickly and be like, hey, for example, for breakthrough, FDA wants us to narrow the breakthrough indication. How is this going to have an impact ultimately on that reimbursement process? So it's been really exciting to be able to do that. So these are some of the members that I work fairly closely with. I think a lot of you guys have probably worked with Tim and John. John, both of them have countless years of experience at the FDA, as well as Robert, who we hired at the same time as I came into the company, and he really focused on neurointerventional. So Gretchen and I, we are representing MICRA at the conference. So hopefully we've had a chance to introduce ourselves to most of you. Gretchen really leads the neuro CRO efforts of our company. And she is also very neuromodulation focused. She's had a number of years with Abbott where she has really taken clinical studies and actually executed them. So I think for us, it's been really great because we have a lot of different things, including digital health and software. And they're all ex-FDAers are very specific to neuromodulation. So it's been really nice to work with everyone. And just neuro-MICRA, we've touched nearly everything in neuro, ranging from diagnostics, I mentioned neurovasculature, neuromodulation, obviously BCI and surgical. So hopefully we have a chance to talk with all of you, and if you guys have any questions, we'll be at the cocktail hour, so you can reach out. So thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to start with a few questions.
Slides, right?
What's that?
We're done with
Oh,
the
we're
slides.
done with the slides.
Yeah.
Does the handheld mic work?
Yep. Well, it's your choice. You can either use the handheld or you can use the podium, your choice.
Look at the world of spinal cord stimulation, a much more mature market where you have numerous players. And my experience with more mature markets coming from the cochlear implants is that every company says they're the best, right? And they show the results that shows they're the best. How do you, as a clinician, decide when it comes to SES? I have a follow-up question. Decide which to use, and can you differentiate in terms of which to use for what patients, and what matters to you within the SES world?
Perfect. I'll start off by saying that the answer to this question has evolved over 10 years. So again, going back 10 years ago, the most important thing was safety. And around 2011, we had some issues with recalls, with lead fractures, with IPGs heating up. So you were looking for the safest company out there. Then 5 years later, with the first level 1 RCT comparing, certain waveform versus our traditional waveform of tonic, that was the first foray into level 1 evidence for spinal cord stimulation. We had a lot of case series. We had some comparisons for non-op versus surgery. But that Senza RCT was our first great evidence-based trial. And ever since then, we've had an explosion of trials with DTM and Sunburst, et cetera. So evidence for me is the currency that I use to really tell patients, this is what I know based on the study works. And if you fit the inclusion-exclusion criteria for that study, I know this is going to work. So that's been the most important thing, evidence. Number 2, nowadays, quite frankly, what I learned from COVID with the great resignation of a lot of our sales force was that your sales force actually matters. I cared solely about the hardware, the software, making sure I put it in correctly, and then I kind of figured it'll be fine. Not true. Actually, the sales force has a huge role. and how those patients fare after implantation. So I would actually say today that my answer is very different than 3 years ago prior to COVID, that I need to make sure that these people are staying on top of the patients and are communicating well with them and with me. So I would say evidence and then the rep support.
Great answer. So we just heard from Neuronov, novel new technology, and there's quite a few startup companies here at various stages. So, how does someone like Manfred end up working with someone like you? What are the various steps in getting through, depending on whether you're private or if you're at UCSF? Describe a little bit just the process. It would be interesting, I think, for some folks here.
Well, it starts like today, meeting like this. So I think you can find out who the people, the early adopters, the people who are really trying to be at the forefront just by being at some of the major society meetings, the major KOL groups, whether at NANS, Aspen, PSPS, CNS even, and really getting a sense for their personality and what they want to do. So I don't think it's too hard to count or name 5 people who would be great to work with. We can work on that together if you want. And you really need a balance these days in the pain market of both academic and private, because frankly, the academicians, I was in academics, you're fraught with the bureaucracy of moving forward. But on the other hand, they're great with the literature, the science, et cetera. The private practitioners can actually get things done, but they're not as strong when it comes to the scientific approach. So you need a nice balance between both ends.
Thank you. And Devjani, in terms of, perhaps this is more with your FDA hat, but in terms of, getting through, we'll use Manfred's company again, through the regulatory process, or, if he were to use MICRA. Can you speak a little bit to that in terms of that process for a company such as, implantable companies such as Manfred's?
Yeah, I think, one thing I always tell clients is with the FDA, if you're thinking about a really novel technology, go with baby steps. You might have a really grand plan, but getting the FDA there takes time. So I always say for your initial marketing application, go for the low-hanging fruits. Mainly because once you have built that rapport with the FDA, you get to understand the processes, you have, they have comfort in your device. It's much easier to expand along the way. So, I think for every company, there's different routes to take. But one thing that I've learned is the process that works is go with something they know, they feel comfortable in, and then innovate from there once you have your first marketing application.
And from a clinician's perspective, other than Manfred's company, which of course is the most innovative thing you've seen in a long time, I'm sure. But let's start with the SES world. What's the biggest innovation that you've seen over the last 5 years in SES, and where do you see the next innovation in SES as a mature, and then outside of SES in the more underdeveloped areas, whether it's PNS or other areas? Where's the next big thing?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest development, I would consider waveforms beyond the 5-year point. I would say feedback has been really important, and how we define that is going to be really interesting, whether it's simply with ECAPs or other forms of sensing how the peripheral and central nervous system are working. So I would say feedback mechanisms, like we've seen in the cardiac world, obviously needs to come to our world. Number 2, I think a simple but yet hugely missing aspect to our field is condition-specific evidence. So if you look at a lot of our major trials, it's pain of the trunk and limbs. As a clinician, that's ridiculous, right? Pain of the trunk and limbs, is it stenosis? Is it knee arthritis? Is it CRPS? That's all comers. That's not really helpful for me. So from a company standpoint, yeah, you want to have the biggest bucket of people to get your device, sure, but it's not specific enough to know how it's going to work for that individual. So one company has painful diabetic neuropathy, that indication. They did that study. That's great. That's condition-specific evidence. You mentioned Mainstay. They have multifidus dysfunction, even though it doesn't have an ICD-10. That's great. You have a specific diagnosis. So that's where SCS is going, and I'm really happy about that. And that's where PNS has to go. And so I consider PNS 20 years behind the SCS market. And we need PNS to say, and I think Manfred's probably going to get to this, like, this is what we use. We've done a study for lumbar radiculopathy, or we've done a study for CRPS, or we've done a study for ilioinguinal neuropathy after hernia repair that didn't go as well. Those specific conditions, and you prove to the market that it works, then as a clinician, if I see that patient with inguinal neuropathy, I'm thinking injectrode or whatever. But right now, if you're just saying you have this device, you're expecting me to figure it all out without really much of an evidence base. So that's the challenge right now with PNS for us.
And Manfred, how do you see your company working with existing vendors today or in the near future?
When you say existing vendors, can you specify?
Neuromodulation companies.
We see our ways to interface with them in more than one way, actually, in that sense that on the one hand, we believe that if you can bring in the trial much, much earlier, like I said there on the slides, directly after steroid injection that fails, you could be an early trial lead. And if all that you do is provide 30-day evidence that this patient can in fact benefit, for example, from DRG stimulation, then if we were to partner with Abbott, we become a gateway company, basically, or our device becomes a gateway device. If we were to work with Medtronic, they can open up that pathway. So we're obviously talking to all of them. At the same time, we're looking at, we do look at PNS as well, but not as directed as on DRG at this point in time. Because on the one hand, PNS, as Nadu said, absolutely correct, is a very broad spectrum, which I think, on the one hand, SPR did a great job at getting everything PNS, and they're being utilized as a trial lead for everything PNS, but it doesn't necessarily convert over if you don't have a chronic effect that they claim they have from a carryover perspective, and then you need to place a permanent device. You don't know if the quote-unquote trial with SPR was a real representation for a Medtronic thereafter, for example. So there's a question of giving the clinician, but also the insurance company, real data that something from a trial converts to permanent, and this is where we can see ourselves as a very nice intersection.
Let's actually go to the audience other than Jim. Does anyone have any questions? Jim.
Thank you. This is a great session, and thanks, Jeremy, for leading it. And sorry for barging in, but I've got burning questions really for everybody here. Starting with Dr. Naidoo. So a question came up earlier. I don't know if you were here, but it was, and there's this kind of debate that's going on LinkedIn, right? And it's, if you're a pain doctor, do you want to be working with multiple vendors, meaning neuromodulation devices, or would you rather? Is it better to just concentrate on one? And there's pros and cons on both sides of it, but really would love to get your opinion.
Yeah, I know Dr. Hagedorn well. I think it was an interesting debate. So I personally was in the tribal mode, where I was with one company. And then they, did something to me, and I switched to another company. And then we were all in teams, and it was West Side Story. And I'll tell you, since the last 3 years, for multiple reasons, I'm not going to go into all the details, I've really just kind of opened up to everybody. And I think especially now when we don't have 3 companies anymore, we now have like 7. We really need to understand everything out there, because it's really not fair to our patients if they come in and they say, hey, there's this startup, what do you think? And you don't know anything about them. So right now, I think this is a really interesting discussion. I think the newer generation of physicians really understand we better know everything. We can't be the Abbott, Medtronic, or Boston guy anymore. We need to understand it. So I sort of agree with John there, but nonetheless, if you have 3 companies that aren't great and 4 that are good, then you're gonna work with the good companies, right? So you're not gonna work with everybody necessarily.
Yeah, anyway, that was an interesting debate. Okay, if I can ask one more, I don't want to be hawk, but if I can ask one more, I'm going to give you more time. I'm going to give you 3 or 4 extra minutes.
I do have one follow-up exactly to that point, if I can ask that one question.
Oh, boys, come on. Ask your question.
So, how many is too many, though, from a practical point of view, where we were talking about this earlier. It's like you're dealing with different reps, different inventory, slightly different nuances and techniques. So is 2 enough? Is 3 enough? Is 4 enough? At some point, it just becomes challenging from a clinician dealing with all these different variables. So how many is too many in a particular sector?
Yeah, so to that point, I mean, we've had to rearrange how we do things clinically when you don't want my MA calling the wrong rep for, the wrong device. So we've really streamlined the process so everyone is understood for which company they are getting their implant with or their trial with throughout the entire process. So right now, frankly, I'm working with 4 different companies. And I'm literally doing a carousel unless there's a condition that is specific to a specific company. So like if you come out with painful diabetic neuropathy data, I'll use that company.
And how much does the patient actually influence it? Oh, I heard that the Medtronic or the
Yeah.
Levanova.
Pretty rarely. I always tell patients, I work with everybody, if you have a grandpa who used to work for Medtronic, I'm happy to, do them for whatever reason. And that has come up. But pretty rarely, most patients will say, you're the doc, you know what's best right now, do what you think.
Okay. All right, can I ask my second question now? Thanks. This is for you, Manfred. You mentioned the BlackBerry versus iPhone, which I thought was an interesting analogy. How apt, I don't know, but so kind of along those lines, before there were Apple computers and IBM PCs, people use a typewriter. And if they made a mistake, it's like, you start all over. And one of the advantages of a word processor is, the undo, right? You can back up. So my question to you is, when you were talking about the extracting a lead, which really hasn't been a capability, been an easy capability, right? Yeah, sure, you can do an extraction, but I'm curious what you think, whether how big of an issue that's going to be. How many procedures do you think that have been done, whether it's a PNS or whether it's an SCS implantation, where the implanter did their damn best, but it wasn't exactly where I wanted it to go? Undo, right? Is that a common thing? And maybe Dr. Nidu, you can chime in as well. Is that a common thing? Is that going to be a game changer, or is that just kind of a nice thing to have?
Asking the non-clinician a clinician question.
All right.
I'm going to be careful
But
because
you're
I understand. So one thing that we've realized is when we speak to clinicians about, I mentioned earlier SPR, and I like what they're doing. I do not want to bash them or something like that, but there is a certain percentage of about 15% supposedly of those leads that you place, they break off, they leave a little tail behind. It might not be a functional problem. It's not going to get infected generally, and is generally not something that is going to be bothering the patient. It's MRI compatible, conditional, but it does irk the clinician. It does irk the clinician that he or she has placed the device that they haven't been able to remove fully. The other point that we had earlier, there's vagal nerve stimulators that need a cuff, and if you need to remove this device, I do not know the percentage of devices that are being removed, you cut the cable, because you cannot get the cuff off. And again, it's not really functionally a problem, but to some degree, the clinicians have the do no harm mantra. So if you put something in, you have to take it back out. And basically, we realized that we can do it. So let's provide the clinician with something that is, if you place it in the wrong location, it is a true try it out lead. So you place it in the wrong location, you're off by 2 or 3 millimeters. Let's take it out. Let's place it on the right location with a slightly different angle. Now you can potentially still treat and save that patient from a pain perspective. So it gives the clinician versatility. It's enabled by a simple device. Simplicity essentially with sophistication.
Okay. Would you mind?
Yeah, so just as far as placement, I mean, I'm a perfectionist at heart, so I am always going to make sure it's right where it's supposed to be, and if it takes me several tries to do it, I'm going to. That's just the way it is. Because you all know if I don't do it right, your therapy doesn't work. So all of you are riding on my shoulders when I do it. So I'm going to make sure it works. But to the point about if there's a fracture, I just wanted to make a point that we're only squeamish because our patients don't want to have a foreign object in their body. And a lot of people don't mind these little fractures from SPR, but some do, and they just don't like the unknown. So that's why we get squeamish about it. So I agree, we do need to work on that aspect.
We did have a few questions. Yes, please.
Yeah, this is, I think, primarily for you, Dr. Naidu. As somebody who used to run one of the big three, I'm acutely aware most things in life, your biggest asset is also your biggest liability. So the sales force is critical in terms of delivering these therapies, as you've already stated. At the same time, it's not scalable. So you have this market where penetration is, you got a long way to go, but then you look at it and you say, okay, well, if we're successful, I'm going to have to keep hiring a very expensive sales force. So now we think about closing the loop, we think about remote programming, and what that means for scaling the business without necessarily having to hire another 1,000 people. I'd like to know from your perspective how that plays out as you think about these new technologies and where you think they're going.
I think that's where we have to go. I think everybody who runs these companies know that the cost of labor is significant, cutting the margins, and who knows what reimbursement will do in the next 10 years. So every company has to look at automation to pick up events that suggest the therapy is failing, and whether or not that's communicating to the sales or the field team that's close to the patient, or a central monitoring group that can reach out to the patient and remotely connect and do all of those things. That is truly the future. There's no question about it. I'm only a little concerned about the remote therapeutic monitoring coding and how that's going to be utilized by clinicians, and what might that be abused. And of course, the FDA and CMS is going to look at all these numbers and probably scale that back if we're overutilizing it. But nonetheless, I do think that's where we're going. The sales teams, I think, will have to reduce to cut costs, and we've already seen that just from COVID as well.
Do you have time for one or two more questions if there are any? Heather?
This goes to Dr. Naidu, my friend, someone that I did research with for many years. I know you are innovative, you do a lot of research, you have high volume. You had mentioned that you choose devices evidence-based, and now there's been a real push lately towards real-world evidence. So I'm wondering if what you have seen with the publications and the evidence-based, the big RCTs, is actually what you're seeing in your practice.
Great question. So most of the time, yes, but not always. So just again, no denigration towards any single company, but one of the major studies I mentioned, one of the level 1 studies, my philosophy is great study. I will give you 5 patients, and I'm going to follow your criteria based on your study. And if within those 5 patients, the results aren't relatively close to what we saw, then I'm moving on. And so one of the companies that had one of the first level 1 studies, I did that. I had 5 patients, and only 1 out of the 5 actually did well. And I abandoned that company, and that company knows that. And the subsequent studies that came out, I did the same thing. And I just said, I'll give you 5, and we'll see how it goes. And, for that company, 4 to 5 did well. It's like, all right. So I kept it going. And since then, hence, with DTM and other companies, I've opened up with using other companies. So my personal thing is 5. I think it's really important that every company invests in registry data to some degree, because look, the real world is very different than your strict study design. I cannot follow IE criteria like more than 10% of the time for my patients, to be really frank. So that's not really going to reflect how my practice is run. So the registry data is really useful, and if we can use big data to come back and say, yeah, this works really well, and people over BMI 40 to 47, or some weird statistic like that, great. That gives me more information beyond what the original RCT did, and then I can continue to use that particular therapy.
And
one
Johnny,
thing-
do you want to final word from the panel, and then over to Jim to close the session?
So one thing I will say about just evidentiary requirements from a specifically just a regulatory perspective, right? So, you guys have mentioned like just expansion to different indications, DPN being one of them. It is interesting that the FDA is looking to real world. They even have, they put a lot of resources into real world. So some of these indications that you guys have mentioned, from a regulatory perspective, they were approved based on literature and registry data. So there was no clinical trial. And I've been seeing, you know, we talked about what the differences, what some of the changes that are coming up in some of these modalities from a regulatory perspective. I see a lot of companies thinking about how to best use real world, especially if they have a device that's already marketed, either in the US or US, and trying to leverage that data to expand that indication.
So that concludes the session. Thank you, everyone. Jim is going to take us home and over to the reception. So please, Jim.